For this video, I wanted to go over and explain the difference between a Type 1 and a Type 2 hypervisor. So I began to create an illustration and decided that there's probably a better one out there already. So I just did a quick Google search and I found this article from 2010 published by ECN magazine. So I'm going to use their illustrations to describe the differences between these two different types of hypervisors. So a Type 2 we'll talk about first. It's probably the one that's easier for you to start playing with and testing on your existing machine. So it would be a product such as VMware Workstation, the old VMware Server. It could be Oracle Box or Oracle's VirtualBox or Microsoft's Virtual PC. It could be Parallels, Boot Camp if you're in the Mac environment. So the way that would work is you would have your hardware. So that would be your computer, with the motherboard, the RAM, the hard drive, all of that. You would install an operating system, so that would be your Windows, your Linux, or your Mac OS, whatever you have. You would install that, and that's how you would normally operate your computer. Where we see these things, App 1, App 2, that's just saying any programs that you may install. So say you install Microsoft Office and you install Photoshop and you install some game that you want to do here. So you can install all of those things, and it doesn't affect anything that we're going to look at with our hypervisor. So we see this block here. It says hypervisor. This is our Type 2 hypervisor. And you say, well, what makes it a Type 2? Well, what makes it a Type 2 is that it's running on top of this operating system. It's not interacting directly with the hardware. So it's counting on this operating system, your host OS, to interact with the hardware. So whatever the hypervisor goes through, it has to go through the host OS to get to the hardware. It doesn't communicate directly with it. There's an extra layer there. So what you would do with your hypervisor, say, in this example, we'll say VMware Workstation. So you would install VMware Workstation. That would become your Type 2 hypervisor. Then you would install whatever guest operating system you would like. So it could be another copy of Windows 7. It could be any Linux distribution, any other Windows, some Unix, things like that. It's possible to do Mac, but it's pretty hard and it's not always completely legal. So we'll just say we'll stick to Windows, Linux, maybe even Unix. So you would install that, and then in here it would work as a unaware that it is a virtual machine. So it would just work just the same as your host OS. But what's really happening anytime that you need to do anything with hardware, you save a file or you move the mouse or you install a new application, what's really happening is it's going through the hypervisor. The hypervisor is communicating to the host, which then communicates to the hardware. It happens, fairly quickly, but there's some extra overhead and there's an extra layer here. So let's look at the Type 1 hypervisor. So a Type 1 hypervisor, you see that we don't have that extra layer of a host operating system. There is no host operating system. This is Type 1, or it's called bare metal. It's called bare metal because the hypervisor sits directly on the host hardware. So the way that one works is you install all of your operating systems and you just communicate straight from the hypervisor, which is usually a really lightweight install, a little lightweight piece of software. The great thing about that is you don't have the overhead of that extra layer, and you don't have as much code, as much things going on to try to secure here. So some examples of a Type 1 hypervisor are Xen. That's the open source hypervisor that a good bit of virtualization is based on Xen. But some of the other ones that we'll talk about are Microsoft Hyper-V or VMware ESXi. So all of those are Type 1 hypervisors. And so the difference is in Type 2, you have a host operating system, and then you install what's essentially a program, and that program becomes your type 2 hypervisor. In a type 1 situation, the hypervisor is installed directly to the hardware. There's no operating system that you boot into. Typically what you're doing is you're not even managing this. So an example is for VMware ESXi. What you would do is you can actually install the hypervisor on just a small USB thumb drive directly to the motherboard. So you would get a motherboard with a place to install your ESXi, and you can install it directly there, and it can run from a little thumb drive. Then when you boot to the screen, there's nothing more than an IP address and some really basic configuration information. Then you would actually manage that virtual server to install all of your operating systems through a client called vSphere. So that's how that one works. But the main point of this little tutorial is to explain the difference between a type 1 and a type 2 hypervisor. And usually when you're learning about these, you'll probably learn about the type 2 before you learn about the type 1, just because type 2 is a little easier to get a grasp of and for you to test out. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this and found this tutorial helpful, looking at the differences between a type 1 and type 2 hypervisor. And again, this article was from ECN Magazine, and it looks like the author was using. So thank you and have a great day.